It all started with something as small and ordinary as a trash can. The neighborhood was neat, quiet, and controlled under the iron grip of the HOA, a place where lawns were measured down to the blade of grass and driveways were inspected like military barracks. On the surface, it was the kind of community that promised order and beauty, the picture-perfect slice of suburban life. But just beneath that surface, behind the white fences and manicured hedges, tension was brewing. The narrator of this story had always been a good neighbor. They paid their dues, trimmed their bushes, and followed every obscure HOA rule to the letter. But their one fault, if you could even call it that, was the trash can. Like everyone else, they had one. Black plastic, city-issued, sturdy wheels, a lid that shut tight. It was placed exactly where it was supposed to be on trash collection day, at the edge of the curb, facing the street. Nothing about it was unusual. Nothing about it was wrong. Every neighborhood has one. That one person, who thrives on rules, who treats the HOA handbook like scripture, who watches everyone else's business more closely than her own. In this neighborhood, that person was Karen. She lived 3 houses down, the kind of neighbor who peeked through blinds whenever a car drove by, who kept a clipboard by her door to jot down infractions, and who took great satisfactions in reminding people that rules are rules. It began innocently enough, or at least it seemed that way. One morning the trash can was found tipped over. The narrator assumed it was the wind, or maybe a raccoon. After all, accidents happen. The trash had spilled onto the driveway, papers scattered across the lawn, banana peels torn from their bags. Frustrated but not suspicious, they cleaned it up and went about their day. But the next week, it happened again. Same thing. The can knocked over. The trash scattered. And strangely, no other house on the street had this issue. The neighbors' bins stood tall and untouched, like soldiers in a row. By the 3rd week, suspicion crept in. The trash can wasn't just tipped, it was shoved, pushed hard, angled away from where it had been neatly lined up the night before. The marks in the driveway told the story. Someone had walked up, grabbed the can, and forcefully knocked it down. And when the narrator looked up, there she was. Karen. Standing at her window, blinds slightly open, watching. That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Karen had declared war. The next HOA meeting confirmed it. Karen, sitting smugly at the head of the table, brought up improper trash bin placement. She didn't mention names, but her pointed glances made it clear who she was targeting. She claimed the bin wasn't aligned properly with the curb, that it was unsightly, and not in keeping with neighborhood standards. No one else complained, but Karen's voice carried weight in the room. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was on the HOA board. The narrator argued, pointing out that the can was placed exactly where city regulations required it. But Karen brushed it off with a tight smile and a condescending remark about community harmony. That night, sure enough, the can was knocked over again. At first, the narrator thought about ignoring it. After all, it was just a trash can. Was it worth a neighborhood feud? But each week, as the bin toppled, frustration grew. The cleanup became routine. The petty sabotage more insulting. This wasn't about a trash can anymore. This was about control, about power, about one woman who thought she could intimidate her neighbors into submission. And so, the narrator made a decision. If Karen wanted a fight, then a fight she would get. But this wouldn't be a shouting match or a petty back and forth. No, this battle would be fought smart, clever, patient. They started planning, quietly, carefully. Every toppled can fueled the fire. Every smug smile from Karen hardened their resolve. They began researching solutions, something Karen wouldn't see coming. Something that would turn the tables, expose her behavior, and end the game once and for all. The idea came late one night, scrolling through forums of people sharing their HOA horror stories. Cameras. Not the obvious kind. Something discreet. Something that could catch Karen red-handed, with no room for excuses. But the narrator didn't stop there. They wanted more than just evidence. They wanted satisfaction. They wanted Karen to know she had lost her grip on the neighborhood without ever being able to retaliate. And so, the plan took shape. A trash can that looked ordinary on the outside, but wasn't ordinary at all. A setup Karen would never expect. The trash can wars had started small, but they were about to escalate into something far bigger. Something that would shake the neighborhood. Something that would leave Karen wishing she had just minded her own business. The narrator was ready. The trap was set in motion, and as the next trash day loomed closer, the only question left was, how would Karen react when her little game finally backfired? Trash day was fast approaching again, and with it came the certainty of another toppled bin. The pattern had become predictable, like clockwork. The narrator knew Karen would strike again. She couldn't help herself. This was no longer about enforcing rules. It was about control, about proving she was the queen of the neighborhood. But what Karen didn't know was that the game had changed. This time, the trash can wouldn't be just a trash can. The narrator began quietly preparing their counterattack. They ordered a motion-activated security camera, small enough to mount discreetly on the side of the house, angled directly at the curb. It wasn't obvious, and it blended perfectly with the siding, a tiny eye in the shadows. To anyone walking past, it looked like nothing more than a utility fixture. But it would capture everything. At the same time, they started modifying the trash can itself. The city-issued container was sturdy, but with some adjustments, it could become something much more. Weighted at the bottom with hidden sandbags, the bin would no longer topple so easily. Anyone who tried to knock it over would find themselves struggling, caught off guard by its new heft. It wouldn't be enough to harm anyone, but it would certainly embarrass whoever thought they could casually push it around. The preparations felt almost like setting a trap in the wild. Every detail mattered. The trash was bagged neatly inside, no loose scraps to attract suspicion. The lid was latched tight. The placement was measured perfectly along the curb, leaving no room for Karen to claim it was out of bounds. Everything about it was ordinary, except that it wasn't. When trash day arrived, the narrator positioned the can like always, then retreated inside, pretending to go about their evening as usual. But their eyes were on the live camera feed. Time passed. Cars drove by. Neighbors set out their own bins. The street grew quieter as the sun dipped below the rooftops. And then, right on schedule, movement appeared on the camera. Karen, she walked briskly down the street, clipboard in hand, as if patrolling the neighborhood. Her gaze scanned each house, searching for violations, hunting for power. When she reached the trash can, she paused. The feed caught her narrowing her eyes, tilting her head, sizing it up. She looked around, making sure no one was watching. And then, as if she couldn't resist the temptation, she stepped closer. Her hand gripped the side. She shoved, but the can didn't budge. Confused, she shoved harder, her body straining against the weighted bin. Still, it stood tall. For the first time, Karen looked rattled. She pulled back, adjusted her grip, and gave it one last forceful push. The can wobbled slightly but refused to tip. It was immovable, rooted like a tree. The camera caught every second of it. Karen's frustration, her confusion, her tiny tantrum when she realized she couldn't knock it over, and finally her retreat, flustered, defeated, muttering to herself as she stalked back down the street. The narrator sat back, watching the footage with satisfaction. Step one of the plan had worked perfectly. Karen had been thwarted, humiliated by her own obsession. But this was only the beginning. The footage alone was enough to prove her guilt, to show the HOA board that she wasn't the enforcer of rules she pretended to be, but a petty saboteur targeting neighbors. But the narrator wanted more than just proof. They wanted justice. They wanted Karen's behavior exposed in a way she couldn't deny, a way that would undermine her iron grip on the community once and for all. The next morning, trash collection came and went without incident. The can stood upright until the garbage truck rolled by, collected its contents, and moved on. It was, for once, a normal trash day. The street remained clean, the driveway spotless, but the real prize was on the narrator's hard drive. Crystal clear video of Karen trying, and failing, to carry out her little sabotage. They didn't reveal it yet. Timing was everything. Instead, they kept the footage safe, like a card hidden, up the sleeve in a high-stakes game. Karen didn't know she'd been caught. She didn't know her every move had been recorded. That ignorance was power, and it gave the narrator an advantage. Meanwhile, Karen seemed restless. The neighbors noticed her pacing the sidewalks more, often muttering about people who don't respect the rules. She began writing more violation notices, slipping them into mailboxes, nitpicking every tiny detail, from overgrown grass blades to slightly crooked shutters. Her obsession with control seemed to grow stronger after her failed attempt with the trash can. But no matter how many notices she issued, no matter how many threats she tried to make, one thing gnawed at her. The trash can. Why hadn't it tipped? What had changed? The narrator could almost feel her paranoia building. And that paranoia was the perfect setup for the next phase of the plan. It wasn't enough to stop Karen. It was time to turn the tables, to make her the one who felt watched, controlled, powerless. The neighborhood had lived under her thumb for too long, and soon they would see her for what she really was. The trap was working. The stage was set, and the narrator was ready to escalate. The trash can had survived the first battle. The next one would be far more public. The footage sat on the narrator's computer like a loaded weapon. It was undeniable, crystal-clear proof of what had been suspected all along. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor or a self-appointed enforcer of the rules. She was the one deliberately targeting the trash can. Her smug facade of protecting community standards was nothing more than a mask for petty sabotage. But holding the evidence and using it were two very different things. The narrator knew that if they confronted her directly, Karen would simply deny everything. She was too practiced, too skilled at twisting narratives and playing the victim. She had the HOA board wrapped around her finger, and any direct accusation would likely backfire. No, this had to be handled carefully. It had to be strategic. The first step was patience. The narrator resisted the urge to reveal the video immediately. Instead, they bided their time, allowing Karen to grow more reckless. The weighted trash can had rattled her. It was clear from her pacing, her constant patrols, and the way she glared at the bin every time she passed by. The more she failed to control it, the more desperate she became to assert her dominance elsewhere. And sure enough, the violation notices multiplied. One neighbor was cited for leaving a garden hose coiled improperly in their yard. Another was accused of having non-compliant flower colors in their garden bed. A third received a warning about leaving a child's bicycle in the driveway for more than 30 minutes. Each petty rule Karen enforced only fueled resentment. Quietly, the neighborhood was beginning to sour on her leadership. The narrator noticed this shift and decided it was time to apply pressure. Not by revealing the footage, at least not yet, but by planting seeds of doubt in Karen's carefully crafted image. It began with whispers. During casual conversations with neighbors, the narrator mentioned strange happenings with their trash can. They hinted that it always seemed to be the only one knocked over, week after week. They didn't accuse anyone directly, but their tone was suggestive, their words carefully chosen. Neighbors began nodding, murmuring about how odd it was, how it always seemed to happen to the same house, how they had seen Karen lingering near the driveway more than once. The whispers grew into rumors, and the rumors began to spread. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, The room was buzzing with quiet suspicion. Karen tried to run the meeting as usual, shuffling papers, rattling off infractions, but she could feel the eyes on her. The trust she once commanded was beginning to crack, but Karen wasn't one to back down. If anything, the rumors seemed to make her more aggressive. She doubled down, nitpicking even harder, desperate to reassert her control. And that desperation led to mistakes. On the next trash day, the narrator set the bin out once again, perfectly aligned, perfectly compliant. The camera was ready. Karen, predictably, couldn't resist. She waited until the street was quiet, then marched up with a look of determination. She pushed. She shoved. She even tried rocking the can back and forth as if brute force could topple it. The weighted base held firm. Her frustration boiled over, and in a moment of anger, she kicked the bin hard enough to hurt herself. The camera caught it all. The grimace, the stumble, the way she looked around to make sure no one had seen. This time, the narrator smiled. They now had not one, but two recordings. Two separate nights of Karen caught red-handed, escalating in her behavior. And with every passing week, her obsession became more obvious to anyone paying attention. But the narrator wasn't done. Simply proving Karen's guilt wasn't enough. They wanted the entire neighborhood to see her for what she was. And so, the plan shifted from quiet defense to public exposure. The opportunity came in the form of the annual HOA barbecue. It was the biggest community event of the year, the one time when nearly every household showed up. There would be food, music, speeches, and, most importantly, plenty of eyes and ears. In the days leading up to the barbecue, the narrator began preparing. They organized the video footage into a neat compilation, splicing the two recordings together. The angles were perfect, the lighting clear, the audio unmistakable. Karen could not explain this away. There would be no denying it once it was shown. But showing it was risky. Karen still held sway over the HOA board. She still had allies who believed her every word. If the narrator was too direct, the board could suppress the evidence, brush it off as taken out of context, and turn the tables back on them. The reveal had to be undeniable. It had to be public, in a setting where Karen couldn't control the narrative. The narrator considered their options carefully. A projector? Too obvious. A laptop passed around? Too easy to dismiss. And then the idea struck. The neighborhood barbecue always featured a slideshow, photos of community events, gardens, holiday decorations. It was a tradition, one that Karen herself usually introduced with great pride. If the footage could find its way into that slideshow, there would be no stopping it. And so, the narrator volunteered to help organize the media for the event. They offered to collect photos from neighbors, assemble them into a presentation, and set up the equipment. Karen, none the wiser, agreed eagerly, praising the narrator for their community spirit. She had no idea she was handing over the very stage that would undo her. By the morning of the barbecue, everything was ready. The footage was buried in the slideshow, timed perfectly to appear in the middle, when the crowd would be relaxed and attentive. The narrator kept their composure, greeting neighbors, serving food, laughing at small talk, all the while knowing what was about to unfold. Karen, dressed in her usual power outfit, strutted around the park with her clipboard, as if she were hosting a royal banquet. She smiled tightly at everyone, shaking hands, reminding people about upcoming rule enforcement reviews. But beneath her polished surface, the paranoia lingered. She still didn't know who was spreading rumors, or why the neighborhood seemed colder than before. As the sun dipped lower and the slideshow began, the narrator's heart pounded. Pictures of gardens, family gatherings, and holiday lights filled the screen. Laughter and chatter rippled through the crowd. And then, seamlessly, the footage transitioned. There was Karen, caught in the act. The video played in full. Her shoving, her straining, her kicking, her retreat. Gasps echoed through the park. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned toward her, and for the first time, Karen was speechless. The trap had sprung. The air at the neighborhood barbecue changed in an instant. 1 second, the crowd was laughing at pictures of summer gardens and block parties, and the next, the screen exposed the truth that no one had dared to say aloud. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of community standards, was caught red-handed, shoving, kicking, and seething at something as ordinary as a trash can. The silence was deafening. Neighbors who had once been cowed by her authority now stared, in disbelief. Parents froze mid-bite, children pointed at the screen, and even the HOA board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Every frame played out in perfect clarity, leaving no room for excuses. Karen had been revealed for what she truly was: petty, vindictive, and obsessed with control. For a moment, Karen simply stood frozen. The color drained from her face, her composure slipping with every gasp from the audience. She glanced around, wildly searching for a sympathetic expression, a nod of support, but none came. The neighbors she once bullied with violation notices now looked at her with a mixture of anger and amusement. The mask of authority she wore so proudly had cracked, and behind it was nothing but embarrassment. And then the whispers began. Low, at first, but quickly spreading like wildfire. Neighbors who had endured years of nitpicking now felt emboldened. They murmured about their own experiences, the absurd citations, the unwanted intrusions, the way Karen had hovered like a hawk over every detail of their lives. It was as if the footage had unlocked a floodgate of grievances, years of resentment finally bubbling to the surface. Karen attempted to compose herself, standing taller, clutching her clipboard as if it were a shield. But the room no longer belonged to her. The slideshow had moved on to another cheerful picture, but the damage was already done. The image of Karen battling a trash can was seared into everyone's memory. The HOA board tried to step in, clearing their throats, attempting to steer the evening back toward order. But their words carried no weight. The neighbors weren't interested in rules or bylaws anymore. They were focused on Karen. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and no amount of polished speech could erase it. Karen's downfall was swift. Where once she had commanded obedience, now she inspired ridicule. The barbecue became a quiet but undeniable turning point. Neighbors whispered in clusters, casting side eyes in her direction, openly questioning her authority. Laughter erupted, sporadically whenever someone imitated the way she had kicked the can, unable to topple it. Karen had gone from feared enforcer to the butt of a neighborhood joke in a matter of minutes. The narrator, watching from the sidelines, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The plan had worked perfectly. Not only had Karen been exposed, but she had been undone in the most public way possible, in front of the very people she had spent years controlling. And the best part? Karen didn't even know who had orchestrated it. But the fallout was far from over. Over the following days, the neighborhood shifted. Neighbors who had once silently accepted Karen's authority began pushing back. They questioned the notices she handed out. They ignored her warnings. Some even tore up violation slips and tossed them in the trash. Karen tried to reassert herself, doubling down with threats of fines and penalties, but her words no longer carried weight. The footage had stripped her of credibility. Still, Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. If anything, the humiliation seemed to fuel her obsession. She began patrolling more aggressively, snapping photos of lawns and fences, filling her clipboard with imagined offenses. She ranted to anyone who would listen about slander and conspiracies, claiming the footage had been edited, that it was all a trick designed to ruin her reputation. But the harder she fought, the worse she looked. The neighbors saw, through her bluster. They remembered the clarity of the video, the undeniable way she had acted. No amount of denial could erase what they had witnessed. The HOA board, meanwhile, found itself in a bind. Karen had been one of their most vocal enforcers, their pit bull on the ground, but now she had become a liability. Complaints poured in, daily, not just about petty violations but about Karen herself, her harassment, her obsession, her inappropriate behavior. The board, once willing to overlook her antics, was now under pressure to take action. Behind closed doors, discussions began about Karen's future in the HOA. Whispers of removal circulated, though nothing was said publicly. The narrator, watching from a distance, knew it was only a matter of time before the board turned on her to protect their own image. But Karen was not going quietly. She became unpredictable, erratic. She stormed through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, demanding to know who had recorded her. She accused families at random, her paranoia spilling over into shouting matches and threats. The more she lashed out, the more isolated she became. And yet, even in her desperation, she couldn't resist the trash can. Each week, she circled back to it, as if unable to accept defeat. The weighted base continued to defy her, standing tall no matter how hard she pushed. Neighbors who witnessed her futile attempts laughed openly now, no longer afraid of her wrath. The trash can had become a symbol of resistance, a monument to her downfall. For the narrator, it was sweet justice. The very object Karen had tried to weaponize against them had become the tool of her undoing. But they also knew something bigger was coming. Karen wasn't finished yet. She was too stubborn, too prideful to slink away quietly. She would escalate again, and when she did, the consequences would be even greater. The neighborhood had turned against her. The HOA board was wavering. And Karen, backed into a corner, was preparing to strike back in one last desperate attempt to reclaim her power. The stage was set for the next confrontation, one that would determine not just the fate of a trash can, but the balance of power in the entire community. The neighborhood had changed. What was once a place ruled by Karen's clipboard and constant patrols had shifted into something different, something freer. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now openly laughing at her antics. The barbecue incident had become legendary, whispered about on porches and driveways, replayed over cups of coffee and backyard fences. For the first time in years, the community felt lighter. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, the laughter wasn't just ridicule, it was betrayal. She had built her entire identity on being the guardian of the HOA, the protector of order, the one who enforced the rules when others were too weak to do it. Now, instead of respect, she was met with smirks. Instead of obedience, she was met with defiance. And in her mind, it wasn't her fault. It was the trash can. The obsession deepened. It wasn't just a bin anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, the one thing she couldn't bend to her will. Every time she walked past it, its solid, unmovable form taunted her. She told herself that if she could just regain control over that one object, she could prove to the neighborhood, and to herself, that she was still in charge. And so, her attacks escalated. One night, the camera caught her returning with a flashlight, creeping up to the curb long after dark. She tugged at the lid, rattled the wheels, even tried to pry it open. When it wouldn't tip, she dragged it a few feet, hoping to leave it out of line with the others. But the narrator had prepared for this too. The can was chained discreetly, to a ground anchor. When Karen realized it wouldn't budge, she lashed out in frustration, slamming her clipboard against it before storming off. The footage was damning, but it was also revealing. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. The neighbors noticed her decline. She began knocking on doors at odd hours, accusing people of conspiring against her. She cornered families in their driveways, demanding to know who was behind the smear campaign. Children were told to avoid her. Adults rolled their eyes when she approached. Karen, once the loudest voice in the HOA, was now an outcast in her own kingdom. The board couldn't ignore it forever. At first, they tried to smooth things over, claiming Karen was simply overzealous. But the complaints stacked higher each week. Parents complained of harassment. Seniors said they felt unsafe with her prowling around at night. Photos surfaced of her snooping into yards, peering through fences. She was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Still, Karen wasn't ready to give up. She hatched one final, desperate plan. On the eve of trash day, she returned once more, but this time she came armed. In her hands was a large jug of foul-smelling liquid, something she had clearly concocted with vengeance in mind. If she couldn't knock the trash can over, she would ruin it. She sloshed the liquid across the lid and wheels, grimacing as the stench rose into the night air. Her plan was clear: make the can unusable, disgusting, so the narrator would be forced to remove it, forced to bend to her will. But Karen had underestimated the watchful eye of the cameras once again. Every moment was captured. The pouring, the splashing, the smug smirk on her face as she wiped her hands on her pants. What she didn't realize was that her actions didn't just affect one person. The smell wafted into the street, seeping into the yards of nearby homes. By morning, the entire block reeked. Neighbors emerged from their houses, wrinkling their noses, horrified at the stench. And then they saw the footage. The narrator wasted no time this time. Instead of waiting for a meeting or planning another subtle reveal, they uploaded the video to the neighborhood's shared group. Within minutes, the evidence spread. Phones buzzed across the street as one neighbor after another opened the clip, gasping, cursing, laughing in disbelief. There was Karen, in full clarity, vandalizing property and making the entire neighborhood suffer because of her obsession. The outrage was immediate. Parents demanded her removal from the HOA. Families threatened to withhold dues if she wasn't dealt with. Some even began whispering about calling law enforcement, pointing out that what she had done was no longer just harassment. It was vandalism. Karen, realizing the storm she had unleashed, tried to spin the story. She claimed it was staged, that the footage was doctored, that the narrator was leading a conspiracy against her. But no one believed her anymore. The smell lingering in the street was undeniable proof of her actions. The once powerful enforcer of rules was now reduced to frantic excuses and wild accusations. The HOA board had no choice. An emergency meeting was called, the fastest the neighborhood had ever seen. For hours, voices rose and fell behind closed doors. Neighbors gathered outside, buzzing with anticipation. When the doors finally opened, the announcement came swiftly. Karen was being removed from her position on the board, effective immediately. She would no longer have the authority to issue notices, enforce rules, or represent the HOA in any capacity. It was a victory, but it wasn't the end. Karen still lived in the neighborhood. She still had her house, her clipboard, her bitterness. Stripped of official power, she became more unpredictable than ever. No longer bound by procedure, she was now acting purely out of spite. And everyone knew that someone as obsessive as Karen wouldn't go down quietly. The narrator felt the weight of it. The trash can had started as a small inconvenience, a petty act of sabotage, but now it had escalated into a full-blown war that had consumed the entire neighborhood. The final battle was coming. Karen would make one last move, one last desperate attempt to reclaim her power or destroy what she couldn't control. And when that moment came, the narrator would have to be ready. Because in this fight, the trash can was no longer just a bin. It was the symbol of who held control in the neighborhood. And Karen wasn't finished yet. The neighborhood was no longer the same quiet, carefully manicured community it had once been. Karen's downfall had left a mark, one that couldn't be ignored. She was stripped of her title, removed from the HOA board, and cast out of the power she had wielded like a weapon for years. But if the neighbors thought that meant peace had returned, they were mistaken. Because Karen wasn't done. Not yet. For weeks after her removal, she lingered like a storm cloud over the neighborhood. She prowled the sidewalks at night, clipboard still in hand, scribbling notes no one cared about anymore. She left passive-aggressive. Flyers tucked under doormats, unsigned but unmistakably hers. She glared from her windows whenever children played too loudly or cars parked slightly too close to her property line. But most of all, she still fixated on the trash can. Every Tuesday night when the bins rolled to the curb, her obsession returned. Even without authority, she couldn't stop herself from circling the narrator's driveway, staring at the sturdy, unmovable bin like it was mocking her. Neighbors watched her from their windows, shaking their heads at the sight of a grown woman consumed by hatred for a piece of plastic. It was inevitable that she would try again. And she did. One late evening, when the streets were quiet and the neighborhood slept, Karen returned for what she clearly believed would be her grand finale. This time she came armed not with a clipboard or a jug of foul liquid, but with tools: a crowbar, a hammer, a pair of heavy-duty gloves. She wasn't just planning to knock over the trash can, she intended to destroy it completely. What Karen didn't know was that she was walking straight into the narrator's final move. Because the trash can wasn't just weighted anymore, it was wired. The narrator, anticipating one last desperate strike, had installed a small, discreet alarm system inside the can itself. The moment it was tampered with, a blaring siren would erupt, lights would flash, and the cameras would record everything, in perfect detail. When Karen raised the crowbar and struck the can, the system triggered instantly. A piercing alarm split the silence of the night. Lights embedded along the driveway flared to life, bathing Karen in blinding white. The security cameras whirred as they locked onto her, capturing her wild-eyed expression in stunning clarity. The neighborhood woke at once. Lights flicked on in every house. Doors opened. Curtains pulled back. One by one, neighbors stepped outside, groggy but curious, only to find Karen in the middle of the street, crowbar in hand, caught like a criminal in the spotlight. The scene was surreal. For years, Karen had been the one pointing fingers, accusing others of breaking rules. Now she was the one caught in the act, red-handed, with no excuse, no explanation, and nowhere to hide. The narrator, watching from inside, didn't need to say a word. The footage spoke for itself. The alarm screamed the truth for everyone to hear. Neighbors gasped, muttered, shook their heads. Some recorded the scene on their phones, already imagining the satisfaction of replaying it later. Children peeked, out from behind their parents, wide-eyed at the spectacle of the once powerful Karen reduced to a frantic, cornered figure in the middle of the night. The HOA board, roused by the commotion, arrived shortly after. But this time there was no debate, no room for argument. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen hadn't just harassed her neighbors. She had crossed into vandalism, trespassing, and outright destruction of property. It was more than just an HOA matter now. By the next morning, the police had been called. Karen tried to spin her story, claiming she was protecting the community, but no one believed her anymore. The footage, the sirens, the witnesses, it all painted a different picture. She was no longer the enforcer of rules. She was the rule breaker. The HOA board issued an emergency vote. For the first time in neighborhood history, they enacted the rarely used clause that allowed for fines and sanctions so severe that a homeowner could be pressured to sell their property. The community had had enough. They weren't willing to live under Karen's shadow any longer. Within weeks, Karen's house went on the market. The once pristine lawn grew untended. The once proud flower beds wilted. The clipboard disappeared from her hand, and the blinds that once twitched with constant surveillance now stayed closed. And then, just like that, she was gone. The day the moving truck pulled away, the neighborhood felt lighter than it had in years. Children played freely in the streets. Neighbors chatted openly on sidewalks. The oppressive tension that had once lingered over every house melted away. For the first time in a long time, it truly felt like a community. As for the trash can, it remained standing, untouched, undefeated. It had become more than just a place to hold garbage. It was a symbol, a reminder that no matter how controlling, how manipulative, how overbearing someone might be, they couldn't always win. Sometimes, the smallest acts of resistance, something as simple as a weighted bin, could topple the mightiest tyrant. The narrator kept the footage, not to gloat, but as proof of how far things had gone. They never intended to upload it online or humiliate Karen further. It was enough that justice had been served, that the neighborhood had taken back its peace. The trash can wars were over. But even years later, whenever a neighbor rolled their bin to the curb, they couldn't help but chuckle. They remembered the nights Karen had waged her ridiculous war, the way she had been undone by her own obsession. And they always glanced at the narrator's driveway, where the legendary trash can still stood strong, never again toppled. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The HOA had learned a lesson too. They had allowed one person too much power, too much control, and it had nearly destroyed the community. From then on, they vowed never to let it happen again. Rules were enforced fairly, evenly, and without bias. The neighborhood slowly healed. But for the narrator, it would always be a story worth telling. The tale of how a petty war over a trash can revealed the true nature of power, control, and resistance. A story that began with scattered garbage and ended with justice, closure, and peace. And in the end, it wasn't just a trash can Karen hadn't seen coming. It was her own downfall.